So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature, and we began to look at the critical essay on Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse-five. So we just finished two sessions on this novel, and we were sort of looking at how the text, especially the opening of the text, and we spent some time on that, how that sets the tone in the philosophy of the novel, which is one of nihilism and cynicism and the loss of temporality, the loss of spatiality, and how this sense of being unhinged in space and time begins to become almost a real corporeal condition in that novel, and which informs the storytelling process. I mean, Vonnegut is unhinged in time, then the protagonist becomes unhinged in time, and so the protagonist in the novel becomes some kind of a counterpoint or the alternate ego of Vonnegut, the writer. And the writer, of course, is very heavily present, as we saw. He himself inserts himself in the opening of the novel and talks about his writerly difficulties, writerly processes and anxieties, and how he constantly considers his novel to be an act of failure because he never could represent what he went through in words. Now, in the next couple of sessions, we will look at this essay, and this should be on your screen, by Peter Kunz, and the essay is called Masculinity, Grey Comedy, and a Vietnam War and Slaughterhouse-five. So, we talked about how this novel becomes a parody of military masculinity, how this becomes some kind of, travesty of military masculinity in a certain sense, right? And of course, there's this quality of grey comedy to it as well. Now, and this is published in the journal called Studies in American Humor. Now, it starts off with the historical significance of post-war American literature, where black humor becomes quite rampant, and it talks about other writers such as, John Barth, Thomas Pynchon, the entire generation of writers who are practicing this black humor. And it starts off like this. This should be on your screen. A noticeable trend in post-war American literature was black humor fiction, in which war, sexuality, death, and other traditionally serious topics received irreverent treatment as authors attempted to depict the irrationality of modern life. So the irreverence comes from irrationality. So the irreverence, the cynicism, the flippancy that informs the depiction of the action and events in the novels are partly a larger reflection of the irrationality of war, the purposelessness, the futility of war, so to speak. And of course, Vonnegut falls squarely in this tradition, along with people like Donald Barthelme, John Barth, and Thomas Pynchon. But Vonnegut's edition is a little bit more complex compared to the earlier writers, and this is where what the essay says. Kurt Vonnegut was a late addition to these authors because, as Max F. Schulz explains, working in multiple modes fostered critical neglect. Yet, as several Vonnegut critics and scholars have noted, black humor does not suit Vonnegut well. So the purpose of this essay, or the theory the essay is trying to promote here, is how grey comedy is perhaps a more suitable form, a more suitable description of Vonnegut's writing than compared to dark comedy or black humor. So while I agree that black humor figures prominently in many of Vonnegut's novels and short stories, I find the term dissatisfying overall because Vonnegut is helpful in a way, but is noticeably, desperately, even absent in a work of the other black humorists. So there's always this kernel of hope, there's always this kernel of transformation, or the possibility of transformation that Vonnegut talks about. And that we saw that when we finished Sirsi Dangaremgo's novel, Nervous Conditions. There's this possibility of hope, a possibility of change despite the traumatic conditions, despite the nervous conditions. And that is where literature comes in, fiction comes in as a very interesting genre, as a very interesting medium. Okay, so he talks about how Vonnegut shares a lot of traditions on black humorists, but then he also has several departures from it. So broadly speaking, Vonnegut shares the black humorist's concern for the individual in society, which may stem from the influence of William Blake on his work. Vonnegut admits that in his Paris review that he went crazy for Blake when he was 35, and he openly refers to Blake in his fiction. And Blake, of course, is part of the romantic tradition, but then of poetry. But then he's also quite dark and cynical and hollow in terms of its depiction of hollowness in industrial England. So Blake forms a large part in Vonnegut's writerly imagination. So, and of course, Blake's poetry, if you read it, is all about the abuse on children during the industrial age, the industrial revolution, how children are so bereft of education, denied education, made to work in very menial settings, in very hard labor settings, and how it just forms the dark underbelly of industrial revolution. So on one hand, there's a sort of narrative of prosperity, progress, growth, rationality, which is all there. But beneath all that, there is a sort of shadowy, spectral presence of abused children in Blake's poetry. And there's a sense of being abused child is there in Vonnegut's writing as well. So, the whole idea of Billy Pilgrim, and the subtext and subtitle of the novel, if you remember, is about children, pilgrimage, children's quest, and it's also a duty dance with death, right? So that sense of being abused by honor, being abused by the supposed code of honor is in Vonnegut's writing as well. Because if you take a look at the age of the people who go and fight in the wars, they're like hardly more than 18 or 19-year-old boys, and they sort of come back from the war either crippled or paralyzed, or mentally hurt to such an extent, mentally damaged to such an extent they can't recover the rest of their lives, right? So that sense of being bruised by time, the sense of being damaged by time, is very much there in Vonnegut's fiction. So in that sense, he's also a writer about abuse, someone who's addressing the abuse to young people at a bodily, mental level. So Vonnegut falls more closely to the idea of grey comedy, and that's something that this essay advocates. So this paragraph, which should be on the screen, says exactly that. A more accurate term for what Vonnegut often does in his fiction would be grey comedy, a blend of absurdist black humor with guarded sense of hope. A light exists at the end of the tunnel, or at least a belief in it exists. We also often see grey comedy in mainstream cinema, and there's examples of mainstream cinema referred here as well. And this is an essay, and I do recommend to read the whole essay, but it talks about how different kinds of art forms, such as novel, fiction, cinema, they're also advocating, a sense of possibility for change, a sense of transformation, a sense of mutation in a positive sense, and in that the grey comedy genre, subgenre, becomes more suitable for someone like Vonnegut, especially when it comes to the novel Slaughterhouse-five. Now, just some historical representation, and in terms of how it was received. Slaughterhouse-five, it appeared in 1969 as descent towards the Vietnam War began to peak. So that was also a time where the popular American resentment against the war was at its high point. It was beginning to peak. So Jerome Klinwitz observes an anti-war novel would not have done so well much earlier. Not until the Tet Offensive in 1968 showed Americans how badly the war in Vietnam was going. So, the knowledge of the Vietnam War going terribly wrong, the knowledge that it was an immoral, illegitimate, illegal war, that knowledge infuriated the Americans. There was a lot of resentment against the war. And in that kind of setting, that cultural milieu, the cultural time, is where exactly Vonnegut's novel is situated, Slaughterhouse-five. A postmodernist tour de force, the novel chronicles and the misadventures of Billy Pilgrim. So it was very much a misadventure novel, and that sense of being unhinged by time, that sense of being, not positioned in time, always outside of time, always, dislocated by time, that is always there. And, contrary to the empowering narrative of time travel, we have a way time travel is an act of disempowerment, where there's an absence of agency, where agency is taken off instead of added to the character. So the novel chronicles the misadventures of Billy Pilgrim, a reluctant time traveler, ricocheted between his experiences in World War II, his captivity on a planet Tralfamadore, and his post-war ennui in the fictional city of Ilium. Right, so we can see how the two fictional cities of one, the planet being Tralfamadore, and the city of Ilium, they represent this otherworldly dimension of ennui, of exhaustion, of tiredness. And therein lies the hollowness of this character, right? So he's just a reluctant time traveler. And so the word reluctance is important over here, because the ontology of reluctance, the politics of reluctance is something that Vonnegut talks about quite clearly. That people are reluctant to fight the war, and that reluctance is very quickly and conveniently equated with cowardice, with lack of honor, with lack of military masculinity, and that was often denigrated and also punished. And there's an example over here where President Eisenhower at that time, he ordered a soldier to be court-martialed because he denied, he rejected and refused to fight in the war. And that reluctant soldier, the figure of the reluctant soldier, becomes very, very important in popular American fiction and cinema emerging around that time. As with many works of great literature, we find that reviews initially around Slaughterhouse-five were very ambivalent and mixed. So some of the reviews were positive. So Robert Scholes and Christopher Lemon Haupt separately gave the novel positive reviews in the New York Times, where Alfred Kazin chided the novel's impishly sentimental humor. It is this humor, however, that performs a noble effort of unsettling the reader and drawing attention to the plight of young male soldiers overseas, boys very much like Vonnegut and the fictional Billy Pilgrim some 25 years later. Now, I just want to spend a little bit of time on this idea of impishly sentimental humor. The word impish is interesting over here. I mean, what is an imp? An imp is a mischievous person, a mischievous young person, normally addressed to boys, naughty boys, boys who wreak havoc, who just run errands and do naughty things and cause discomfort and inconvenience to other people. This sort of idea of imp as being wicked, as being mischievous, as being unhinged. And exactly is this quality, this impish sentimental humor, is exactly what makes this novel so disconcerting. There is no steady flow of humor. There's no steady supply of humor. There's no emergence of humor as a transformative, happy category. And this is a distinction that I also made, if you remember, when you're reading Catch-22. The humor in Catch-22 is not a humor of happiness. It's actually the humor of exhaustion, the humor of being unhinged, the humor of being abandoned, the humor of exhaustion and hollowness put together, right? So there's a similar quality of humor in Slaughterhouse-five as well. In saying the novel is about impishly sentimental humor, what Alfred Kazin actually did was praise the novel, was really get to the heart of the novel, the pulse of the novel, so to speak. So, the whole idea of Vonnegut's magnificent popularity, was obviously there at that time when the novel was written. It was seen as some kind of a profoundly political text, but Vonnegut does much more than just critique the Vietnam War. When talking about trauma, and talking about represent trauma in fiction, what he also does, he decries and debunks and undercuts commonly considered notions of masculinity, of valor, of heroism, and all of that, which are commonly consumed as traditional categories of heroism or military masculinity, etc. So that entire machinery, the entire package of masculinity, which is commonly consumed and considered to be heroic and noble and glamorous in quality, is entirely decried. And that's exactly what Vonnegut aims at. So, Vonnegut was writing about World War II, not Vietnam, but his target remains clear, despite the change in the geographical and historical context. By employing black humor, Vonnegut was able to underscore these issues and disturb his audience into paying attention and even into a new consciousness. And that's, again, the hallmark of any great work of literature, to usher in a new consciousness, to create a new consciousness, to talk about something which is radically different at an epistemic level, at an imaginative level, at a collective level. And this novel does that. And in that, it becomes a hallmark. It becomes a major milestone in great literature around that time. And there's a reference to Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead and Joseph Heller's Catch-22, and how there are novels already changing the notions of war and military masculinity. But Vonnegut complicates it further by infusing the idea of magic realism, infusing the idea of pseudo-magic, some kind of a supernatural machinery of time travel, which instead of empowering the character, takes away agency from the character as we see it. So, Vonnegut complicates these inhibiting legends by engaging and revising them, and not so much to defame the American participation as to show the dehumanizing rather than masculinizing effects of war on those who fought. To this end, Vonnegut lobbies on behalf of the boys who now follow in his footsteps, invoking his own experiences to demystify the false values and unfair pressures that compel them to service. So, we talked about this sort of compulsory masculinity, the compulsory condition of heroism that war, the idea of war generates in popular imagination. Now, instead of that, we find Vonnegut offering a very fragile model of masculinity, a very numbed model of masculinity, a very vulnerable model of masculinity. And in equating vulnerability to masculinity, he offers a very radical repositioning, a radical representation of the war, and which is very radical at that point in time, because we were looking at we're talking about a condition, a cultural condition, which is constantly celebrating and consuming this idea of military valor and this impregnable stoic masculinity, and against that, Vonnegut offers a more vulnerable model, right? So, and the whole idea of Dresden, of course, becomes interesting, and that is the sort of the centerpiece in the whole novel. Now, Vonnegut's friend Laurie Rackstraw recalls that when a writer visited his war buddies, nobody had the same story or could remember the details. This difficulty led Vonnegut to consider having the pages become increasingly darker until the Dresden scenes, at which point the novel's pages would entirely darken. Now, look at the experimental stylistics in the novel, where the sort of time traveling back and across, and how the pages depicting Dresden would just fade from memory, would just become so dark that it cannot even be remembered. But the larger point over here is the fallibility of memory, the unreliability of memory, and that's something which Vonnegut constantly talks about. I mean, he himself can remember things properly, and when he revisits his war buddies, they can't remember the same thing, in the same ways. They all remember differently, and the difference in remembering and the sort of difficulty in remembering details is exactly what frustrates him as a storyteller, but also what ironically makes the story authentic in quality, makes the story so legitimate in quality. And this sort of sense of legitimization drawn from unreliability is exactly what makes this such a classic war novel, where it's a very legitimate and authentic representation of war, precisely because of its unreliability and uncertainty, right? So in that sense, it's sort of comparable to some of Joseph Conrad's novel about the colonial masculinity and its misadventures, right? So, and there are certain sections from the novel which are quoted, and the reason why I chose this essay is because, as I mentioned, it's quite a comprehensive coverage on this kind of masculinity. And we find, this is page 418, quoted from the book, where the idea of masculinity is talked about. So and this is Vonnegut's remembrance of how young he was, he and his companion called Bernard, during the war. You were just babies in the war, just like the ones upstairs. You'll pretend you are men instead of babies, and you'll be played in the movies by Frank Sinatra or John Wayne or some of those other glamorous, war-loving, dirty old men. And war will just look wonderful. So we'll have a lot more of them, and they'll be fought by babies, like the babies upstairs, right? So we see how there's a very deliberate and stubborn depiction of how unprepared they were, how vulnerable they were, how fragile they were to fight the war, and how the entire industry of representation, popularly represented by cinema, the Hollywood cinema, we've seen in the previous session as well, even inside the novel, the cynicism about film, the cynicism about cinematic representation of war is very much there as part of Vonnegut's writerly discourse, right? Now, what's interesting is he talks about how the war as represented in cinema would be embodied by, that kind of masculinity would be embodied by those good-looking, much older, more matured men. Well, the reality is the war was fought by little boys who hardly knew what was happening, who had hardly any idea, who were just sent as fodder, to be sort of slayed in the war. And it just came back. Most of them died in the war, and the ones who came back were just damaged forever, and they could not remember, they could not forget, they could not sort of move on in their lives. Most of them. So, but contrary to the reality, the representation of this masculinity was done by much older, good-looking movie stars who completely, embellished the project. It was a strategic embellishment, strategic beautification or aestheticization of the war, and that just becomes the problem. Okay, so now this subtitle of the novel requires some unpacking. He mentions, he consequently, we can see the essay also refers to that. He consequently, subtitles the novel "The Children's Crusade," invoking a romantic notion of the child as innocent in order to appeal emotionally to the readership, to have sympathy for the soldiers. Now, in a certain sense, he is representing the soldiers as they really are. He's not infantilizing the soldiers. He's representing the real age of the soldiers, the real mental, physical, emotional condition of the soldiers. Is barely young men who were just sent to the war and did not have any idea what was going on. But it was a children's crusade. It was fought by children. So the quality of abuse comes in, and this is what I was talking about earlier when the reference to William Blake was done. Even in Blake's poetry, you find the children are being sort of sent to this menial, dirty, dangerous jobs during the Industrial Revolution in England. So beneath this progress and prosperity and this economy that the Industrial Revolution was bringing, there's also the question of child abuse, the question of sending children to do works which are dangerous for them, which often had very serious health hazards and repercussions. So similarly, we find that the Vietnam War, the Second World War, all the wars fought by Americans and other countries in the world, just sent young men to fight the war. And we saw that in the beginning of this course when we read even a short story like Cathy Mansfield's Fly, where the boss's son was just sent to the war without his will, and he just got killed. Barely a boy out of his boyhood, just on a cusp of becoming a man, got tragically killed, tragically taken. So that sense of being taken, that sense of being consumed by the war is very much there. So the Children's Crusade, invoking a romantic notion of the child as innocent in order to appeal emotionally to the readers. The implications for the current conflict in Vietnam are obvious, particularly in the novel's concluding chapters, where the writer reflects on the recent assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, both of whom were advocating an American withdrawal from Vietnam by 1967. So, we can see the way in which, despite being magic realist, despite being having this sort of time travel across different destinations, the sense of political reality is very much there. So, the sense of the connecting to political movements, political moments, political figures is very much there in Vonnegut's novel. So I stop at this point today. We're just going to wind up by saying that this is a profound novel about an anti-war sentiment, anti-war moral message. But the reason why it is such an important novel, especially for a course like this, Trauma and Literature, it talks about the uniqueness of the literary medium, the literariness of this piece of writing. Because if you remember, it opens up as being some kind of a memoir where Vonnegut is sort of ostensibly writing about himself and how he can talk about his Dresden experiences. And then he very quickly moves on to almost like a magic realist mode, where he brings in Billy Pilgrim as a protagonist, who's some kind of a foil to Vonnegut's persona, and who is this inadequate, insufficient, fragile character, very vulnerable, very precarious, hardly able to sort of administer what's happening around him, and he becomes the protagonist in the story. And the fragility of Billy Pilgrim is reflective of the fragility of the young men sent to the war. Now, all this magic realism, time travel, etc., all situated within the context of political reality. And the reference to Kennedy, the reference to Martin Luther King, the reference to people being executed because they were protesting against the war is very much there. And this makes the novel a profound work of political fiction, as well as being a novel about trauma and literature. So I stop at this point today and will conclude with this novel in the subsequent session. Thank you for your attention.